Welcome to the Pivot Clean Energy Podcast, How the World Cooks, the energy shift you need to know about. I'm your host, Alicia El-Mamouni. On this podcast, we are going to explore everything cooking, how it impacts the world, and why you should care. Let's go. Boris Atanassov is the founding director of GreenLight Africa, a regional consultancy firm with a base in Mozambique that specializes in energy and environment. He has over 14 years of experience in research, project management, and business development. Boris holds a Master's of Science from Stockholm University, specializing in energy transition, focused on renewable energy, bioenergy, climate financing, and market development, as well as social and environmental impact assessments. He has strong experience in developing feasibility studies, market research, policy analysis, institutional capacity building, developing business plans, and managing projects within the mentioned fields. And so today we are coming to our final continent in our travels around the world, looking at bioethanol production, policies, and potential, and we are landing in Africa. We are going to hear about a more personal look from Mozambique, where GreenLight is based, as a representative view of Africa, but also hear about the continent as a whole and what bioethanol production and use currently look like. We will hear about countries that have begun implementing bioethanol and what the potential for expansion could look like across transportation and cooking sectors, as well as the three key elements in really helping the industry develop. Join us as we head to Africa to look at clean fuels. Hi, Boris. Welcome to the show, How the World Cooks.
Oh, thank you very much, Alicia. Great to be on and happy to share some of my insights.
Wonderful. We are just wrapping up a series of looking at bioethanol around the globe. We've gone to every continent so far except for Africa. And so you are going to share a little bit about bioethanol in Africa, what that looks like from a feedstock and volume perspective, some of the policies, where you see the sector headed. So we're really excited to have you on the show today to share some of your expertise. You are the founder and CEO of GreenLight Africa, which is a consulting company that's based out of Mozambique. Can you give us a little background on what GreenLight is and what you do?
Wonderful. Well, as you said, I founded GreenLight in 2010. It's been quite an interesting 14 years already operating out of Mozambique and into several of our neighboring countries. We have focused on two specific areas. One has been on the energy sector that branches off into biofuels, renewables in the sense of electrification via solar, hydro. We've looked at wind. Our focus has also been quite extensive on rural electrification technologies, such as your mini grids, solar home systems, productive use of energy systems. And it's been a whole lot of fun just implementing these projects from research all the way through to practice. And then we also have a bit of an environmental leg of the company, which has been growing over the years. So we do environmental impact assessments, environmental management plans, environmental audits. And these tend to be quite linked with the energy work that we do. And that's been... as a result, it's been a multidisciplinary team, so both environmental and energy engineers and practitioners in the company.
Wow, so you guys have quite a wide depth of experience across the energy sector in general. Looks like you're doing a little bit of everything, and we're going to talk more about that today. But tell me a little bit more about your background and experience. How did you come to start GreenLight in the first place?
Well, it's a long story, starting with the fact that I was born and raised in Mozambique, and Mozambique is one of the countries that has quite the largest potential for renewables, including biofuels, on the continent. And in fact, policy-wise, the country has advanced quite much forward. So, GreenLight was started as a company that would answer to those policy and strategic objectives, not only of Mozambique, but many other countries that we've worked in. And how it all started was my education background from South Africa and then over to Sweden. Within Sweden, as most people are familiar, they have very forward environmental and energy-based research, development, policy environment. And so that's specifically what I studied and began to work with at a place called the Stockholm Environment Institute. And that was quite a lot of exposure on both biofuels and other energy-based solutions, which inspired me to come back to Mozambique and apply what I worked on in policy and research into more of a practical application. And so it's basically bridging that gap of what's on paper and materializing that into practice. And that's the result of many of the projects that we've done, which bring both elements together, and we have things to show on the ground.
Yeah, not an easy feat, I'm sure, to get projects from the concept phase to the actual implementation phase. And are you working primarily in Mozambique, or are you working in some of the other countries surrounding Mozambique as well?
So our primary market is Mozambique, thankfully, given that it's the home base and home
Yeah.
office as well for the team. However, we have expanded to the other Lusophone countries. So we've looked at Angola, we've looked at Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau as interesting markets to basically transfer a lot of our know-how that's been developed and created in Mozambique to these countries that have come in a little bit later in the sector development. So it's been a good opportunity. But we've also worked in East Africa. We have had several assignments in Kenya and Tanzania, Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda. It's been quite interesting to be able to work in these other neighboring countries as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about some of the projects you've supported, maybe one or two that really stick out in your mind?
Sure. So one of the areas that we've worked in is clean cooking, which has been closest to my heart, at least because the consequences of not cooking with clean energy sources are just so much more serious than most people consider.
Yeah.
So projects where we've introduced clean cook stoves, whether it's ethanol cooking or whether it's other solutions such as pellets, such as even more sustainable based biomass solutions like briquettes, are the ones that I find the most interesting and fulfilling to work with.
Mhm.
And we've supported companies with clean cook technologies, as mentioned, with pellets. We've worked with gas fire stoves. We've worked with ethanol cook stoves in the past. We've developed entire portfolios for these companies in country and implemented on their behalf some of the projects. Other interesting projects and programs that we've supported, for example, in renewables and with focus in Mozambique, has been running on behalf of the government and providing technical assistance for the renewable energy auction program called ProLair. So that's a pioneer program that shifted large-scale IPPs, independent power producer projects, from what was unsolicited bids that had a lot of controversy in terms of how the contracts were attributed to a more transparent and I would say cost smart way of implementing energy projects as for the government's interest via a reverse auction model that was developed with all the contracting modalities that we developed and the entire process for procurement that has been supported. So that's been one of our most impressive projects over the past years. And now looking at productive use of energy. So solar irrigation, solar refrigeration, innovative models to introduce these to community members. So branching off into the rural electrification part of things. So these are some interesting and exciting projects that we've worked with.
Yeah, yeah, and really valuable, very needed in lots of parts of Africa. So, yeah, thank you for sharing. You mentioned bioethanol cooking and some of your other cooking projects, but before we talk about that, I just want to talk about the general bioethanol use in Africa. And so
Mhm.
we've been talking about bioethanol around the world, how it's produced, feedstocks, and uses. But what are the primary feedstocks that are used in Africa? And that might be a regional thing, but what have you seen in terms of the primary feedstocks for bioethanol?
I think you generally have similar tendencies, specifically within sub-Saharan Africa and countries within the region of Mozambique that we've worked with. Sugarcane is your primary feedstock source, and that's mostly via the molasses. Given in some countries, specifically looking at Mozambique, for example, there is a sugar market that
Hmm.
one has to consider as well. So molasses being a co-product or byproduct of the industry is an interesting feedstock that's been used. In Mozambique, for example, we have four large estates that produce for 50,000 tons of sugar a year, for example. That's quite a lot of sugar,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of molasses that's used as a feedstock that can potentially be produced into ethanol, currently exported.
Mm-hmm.
We also look at cassava as a very interesting feedstock, specifically in the context of Africa and context of rural adaptability for smallholder production, given its climate adaptability and adaptability to less richer soils. Uh, what I mean is less need for inputs compared to sugarcane, for example. So, although sugarcane has higher yields, cassava has the most adaptability, I believe, in the context of Africa, in the context of um, rural development, in my opinion. And then sweet sorghum. Sweet sorghum is not being so widely used as its potential could, but we do believe that it is a feedstock that has promising future for specifically bioethanol production, specifically looking at varieties that are more climate tolerant, so tolerant to less rainfall, which is becoming more and more of a reality with climate
Yeah.
change that's being experienced. So I would say these three are your most interesting feedstock to look at and mostly
Okay.
used.
So sugarcane, the byproduct molasses, and then
Mm.
cassava.
And sweet
And what is
sorghum.
and sweet sorghum, I'm sorry. Yes, sweet sorghum. And what are the typical end uses for bioethanol that's being produced currently?
Well, in its large majority, the alcoholic beverage industry, I would say,
Sure.
it's one of the main uses, um, and a very large market indeed. We've
Yeah.
seen sanitizer increase in the past few years, specifically due to COVID. That in itself has also, I believe, somehow stimulated the investor interest in ethanol for blending purposes. I think that's also an interesting spin-off of COVID, that it created a market for sanitizer that no longer is so prominent, which
Yeah.
might lead to other opportunities, specifically for some of the new investments on the continent. And then, of course, for blending purposes. So we have a few countries that are already blending in the continent, Malawi, Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and others that are very close to reaching blending,
Mhm.
including Mozambique. So that would be actually possibly one of the largest uses, specifically in the case of Mozambique, if you consider the
Mhm.
targets.
Yeah, so blending in transportation fuel is very similar to what we do in the US here in most of our fuel. And
Exactly.
so what does that look like in terms of volume currently? Do you have an idea of what the total use for bioethanol is on the continent?
Indeed, I was actually trying to piece together that information a few months back when we were putting together a report on bioethanol uh, production on the continent, and then in this case we were looking at Mozambique and lessons learned, and
Mm,
a lot of the bioethanol or ethanol industry being targeted towards the alcoholic beverage usage it was difficult to put together some of those numbers. So I don't have a specific number for the continent. I did put together forecast for Mozambique, for example. So um, what normally is the way that we do it is we look at the current and projected fossil fuel consumption, look at the targets that these countries have in place. And in the case of Mozambique, it starts with E10 from as soon as this year and moves all the way up to E20 by 2033. And we projected the demand based on that and those figures. And so to blend in Mozambique, for example, as soon as 2025, and looking at the E10 mandate, we would need as much as 73,000 cubic meters. So that's a lot of ethanol that would be needed. And currently, for example, we only, as a country, have a capacity to produce 27,000 cubic meters.
Okay.
So that's only 30 something percent of the demand that will actually be needed in the coming months. So
Definitely a
that
gap
shows
there.
you.
Oh.
That shows you what we're currently able to produce or producing, and what indeed will be needed as demand will surely show.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think that one of the reasons it was difficult to see the amount of volume used on the continent is because it's pretty fragmented? Every country is doing their own thing in terms of bioethanol production and use.
Exactly. That was the main challenge when we were looking at figures and trying to piece together experiences from the different countries and forecasting. Specifically, when you look at policies that are not clear with regards to their targets and capacity to meet those targets, which
Sure.
is your main consideration. Because if you look at targets, many times you assume that there is capacity, but in actual fact there isn't, and these targets may be sooner or maybe more ambitious than the country is ready to meet.
Mm-hmm.
So here we need to consider imports or potential imports to signal the market, and
Yeah.
hence there's where the problem in quantifying the demand comes in. Our
Mm-hmm.
country is going to open up to importation? Are they wanting to develop their local industry? And if they're going to develop their local industry, how much of it can actually be developed to reach the targets?
Mm-hmm. And do you know what that split looks like today? How much of the bioethanol used on the continent is from local production versus imports?
I'm not quite sure. I know most of the countries are that have signed up to blending mandate are mostly using local production when possible, when needed. For the case of Mozambique, I can tell you that policy is more favorable for local production, and that's what the the goal is, the ultimate goal.
Mhm.
So I would say countries start off looking at local production and
Sure.
will top off the difference or close the gap with potential importation. Now, what that split or that difference is, I believe, will only be possible once local production is kept at the fullest potential of the moment. So there isn't a
Sure.
figure yet that's able to divide, but I do believe that the importation will be the gap that needs to be filled to meet the targets.
Yeah.
In the case of Mozambique, for example, if you're looking at the local production opportunity now, you would need to meet close to 70% via imports, for example.
Hmm.
So,
Sure. And that could be an important consideration while they're developing their local capacity and increasing their agricultural potential.
yeah, indeed.
Do you have an idea of what the potential for bioethanol production is on the continent, particularly if you see the agricultural potential really being tapped into? I mean, is even just a general idea would be helpful.
Well, to be honest, we have as a continent the full potential to be fully autonomous in terms of our production and to meet the consumption targets. In fact, all the conditions are available, be it land, be it favorable climate, be it uh, availability of water. If you're looking at different countries and uh, studying the feasibility of bioethanol in each one of the countries that has blending mandates, you begin to understand that there is capacity to produce locally.
Wow.
I won't speak in volumes because the volumes or the potential in volumes I believe is the full blending need, not only for vehicles but also for clean cooking. If you're starting to look at the option of ethanol as a clean cook alternative to charcoal or firewood or other solutions like LPG or electricity that might not be readily available in some countries,
Mhm.
um, then the potential is even so much more higher just by the sheer number of biomass users. But I do believe that can be met locally. Another factor to consider that in the case of Mozambique specifically, we are looking at the smallholders and their ability and availability to be outgrowers for bioethanol feedstock. That in itself is an immense opportunity, both in their willingness and mostly in their need to be involved in a value chain, given the lack of such value chains in many of the rural economies in African countries. So that I do believe is something that potentially needs to be more highlighted when it comes to the bioethanol dialogue. It's looking at smallholders and the social impact that can be created and the volumes that they are able to produce.
Absolutely. Yeah, it could have really huge implications for the rural economies in Africa. And we've seen that even here in the US, small towns in the Midwest that have really benefited from having a bioethanol plant nearby just because of all of the industry that it encourages.
Mhm. Correct.
Yes. Have you seen the industry grow over the past couple of decades? Have you seen more countries jump on, whether that's for blending or other purposes, or has it been fairly consistent?
To be honest, it's been the opposite. It's declined since the European blending mandates were announced in the early, no, in the mid 2000s. We've seen that there was a quite a large investor interest in producing ethanol feedstock for the European market as export feedstock. That slowly withered away with global changes in economics and policies that made it less interesting from an investor point of view to focus on ethanol as a feedstock for export purposes. And then it was quite a quiet period until the 2020s when there was quite a push on the policy agenda for biofuels to be back on the table. That came to a surprise for some, but in my opinion, it was very much expected. And that's mostly because of international policies and strategies looking at energy transition, net zero emissions, and countries' commitments to reaching these targets, specifically reaching their NDCs. So in my opinion, there has been this recent push for a different purpose or a different goal, and I do believe that will be a more positive trajectory for growth. Actually,
Yeah, and it's also allowing countries to meet some of their climate goals as well. And so I wanted to ask if, there are specific incentives in place. You mentioned several countries that have been more focused on implementing blending mandates and whatnot. What do you think the motivation has been for including clean fuels into their ecosystems?
well, traditionally the I would say the goal of these countries is to reduce imports of fuels. I think that remains a an incentive for these countries as such.
Hmm.
These countries, I mean countries that are dependent on fuel imports, that are spending a considerable budget on these imports, and also in turn have the potential to produce at least part of that fuel locally. And this is where biofuels comes in. So
Hmm.
in the case of Mozambique, for example, one of the main goals for government, specifically since they've announced a new blending mandate that was passed last year, and a new strategy for biofuels and an economic stimulus package that also includes biofuels as part of the industries that are going to be focused on. It's
Hmm.
to develop the rural economy. And that's, I think, where it becomes interesting to look at the fact that there are incentives currently available for rural and for agricultural development projects, and these incentives can be used for biofuels. We have full tax breaks actually for companies in 10 years that wish to invest in feedstock production and in processing.
Okay.
So that's an immense opportunity here already. And we do believe that other fiscal incentives will be coming on board as the sector develops, and to stimulate more the sector, specifically when looking at ethanol as a final fuel. So,
Hmm.
so as mentioned, net zero emissions targets, energy transition targets, your NDCs and climate targets of countries, and then coupled with rural development objectives. These are your most recent goals that the government has or have. And we've seen this in other African countries
Hmm.
as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know that we were very excited to see Mozambique moving forward in this, and Pivot has been working with you and other partners on the ground to really help guide some of those discussions and provide resources that we can. And so we're really looking forward to seeing Mozambique come on board with a biofuels policy and start implementing. And I'm hearing that you think that there's room for bioethanol to grow in Africa, specifically around transportation, probably clean cooking as well. What are some of the challenges that could prohibit growth in that sector?
Well, if you look at the challenges that one considers, it would be those that are common to most sectors, most investment sectors, be it policy, be it favorable or non-favorable investment climate. These are common challenges we see in several African countries. Maybe going a little bit out of the box here, or not so much out of the box these days, it's your climate shocks that I believe will be your biggest challenge. I think we are going to be
Mm.
seeing more variable rainfall, droughts, more floods, and biofuels as a predominantly agricultural dependent fuel. They in fact could suffer as a consequence of these climate shocks,
Sure.
and we've seen that they are affecting many African countries. In the case of Mozambique, we have an increased number of cyclones per year that are destroying entire fields, and this is most worrying for smallholder farmers that don't have technology that allows them to mitigate and to adapt to these shocks. So that's I would say the most concerning gap. Um, Having said that, of course, we can look at innovation for a potential solution to these challenges,
Yeah.
and that's quite exciting in terms of looking at solar irrigation for certain crops that mitigates the drought conditions that are experienced. I mean, we have technologies suitable for smallholders that are solar based and pay as you go enabled, which means that farmers can pay little by little over a span of 1, 2, even 3 years for their technologies. And after that period, it becomes theirs for the long run. We have a whole lot of innovation when it comes to insurances, agriculture insurances. We've seen a few organizations already introducing these packages to rural farmers, which in fact will provide a buffer when it comes to climate shocks.
Sure. Yeah, do you think that policy can also have an impact, or how important do you think it is to have policies in place that either prohibit or encourage the growth of biofuels?
Policies are fundamental. You need to signal the market, and when you have, in the case of biofuels blended into vehicle fuel or transportation fuel, when you have a clear blending mandate with clear targets, dates, and procedures that are very transparently laid out and in fact easily understood by investors, you will
Yeah.
have an interest in developing the sector. And for the case of Mozambique, we are already seeing this with the adoption of
Hmm.
a new blending mandate that came into force last year. So, like Mozambique, other countries are following suit or have already implemented such mandates, and that's shown in practice as they've started their programs. Malawi, for example, is an interesting case.
Sure.
So, yes, policy is fundamental. Policy is your first step towards any bioethanol sector development
Hmm.
strategy as a whole. It starts with policy and starts with the willingness of government to, via policy, introduce those incentives that make it possible for the sector to be viable cost-wise as well.
Sure. Yeah, so jumping back to clean cooking, I want you to share just a little bit of your experience. I know you've had a little bit of experience with bioethanol clean cooking in Mozambique. And so if you could just share a little bit about that and the impact that it had on you and even shaped some of the activities you do with Greenlight.
As I mentioned, clean cooking is a passion of mine, and it's one of the most meaningful areas to be working with. So, experience-wise, I mean, my clean cooking experience started from my master thesis, which I focused on ethanol for cooking in the
Mhm.
context of Mozambique as a hypothetical approach to an alternative that, in my opinion, as a student, made a lot of sense. And little did I know that I was going to then be contacted by investors that were interested to develop this project, specifically in
Wow.
Mozambique. And
Okay.
so I'm quite grateful for that opportunity, which was brought forward by what is today one of the largest clean cooking companies with focus on ethanol, which is cocoa.
Mm.
So I did have the opportunity to work on the commercial pilot and set up a lot of the operations that enabled the project to move forward and today be replicated in other countries. And that was a very interesting experience, and I can tell you specifically why. It did focus on the entire value chain, so from production of ethanol, from smallholders, looking at cassava, into processing it into bioethanol, and then commercializing it in urban areas with a lot of marketing, a lot of behavioral change communication, a lot of
Yeah.
techniques that were innovative and are still innovative, which made it possible to have a record number of users of ethanol cook stoves in quite a short time. And considering
Hmm.
it was only a pilot, I think it was quite phenomenal, the experience. So that was one of my most I would say exciting clean cooking projects. Since then, we've worked on multiple other technologies. As mentioned, production of briquettes, of pellets, looking at gas fire stoves, applying the same techniques that we did for ethanol cooking for these other cook stoves and cooking fuels. And it's the same recipe. You need to make the stove desirable. You need to make it an
Sure.
aspirational item to have in the household, and that's the trick. That's the
Hmm.
trick, and people will pay for it. There is money in the communities. We 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 shouldn't consider charcoal users as poor households that cannot afford other fuels because charcoal
Mm.
is very, very expensive. It's just the fuel switch, which is difficult, and the behavioral change,
Sure.
which is a challenge. So you make it an interesting technology, which is aspirational. People will
Mhm.
shift expenditure from charcoal or firewood when it comes to scarcity to ethanol and other clean cooking technologies.
Mhm. Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, the willingness of individuals to switch. And it sounds like if the right elements are in place, people are more than willing to consider transitioning to another technology. And so that's really encouraging for bioethanol as it begins to expand. And thank you for sharing about your own personal experience. That had to have been really amazing to see your concept on paper come to life right in front of you, and now to watch it continue to grow across the continent. That has to be pretty special.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's been an adventure, and also have to be grateful for these opportunities to basically take us where we are today as a company that focuses on multiple renewable based solutions. And it all started from clean cooking, so that in
Yeah,
itself shows you where the primary energy source can lead towards, and also come back to it as a very important element that needs to be still considered, because I can tell you in the 14 years that I've been working in the sector, we are still in the dire need to have more people switch to clean cooking.
sure.
It's very challenging. And in fact, when looking at the funding for clean cooking over the years, it's not been enough to make that difference. And
Right.
so um, one of my main concerns now is to stimulate more project-based financing, whether it's grant-based, whether it's looking at commercial financing for clean cooking or other sources. It needs to be back on the table. So I do believe that the impact still needs to be reached.
Yeah, investment's going to be one of the critical determinants in how successful clean cooking is on the African continent and globally. Would you say that's one of the key factors in something that could really drive development of the bioethanol cooking sector in Africa? Maybe list your top three things that could really drive development in that sector.
Well, they're all interlinked. I think policy, financing, and of course, user behavior
Sure.
and behavior change are your main elements, but they're interlinked because one without the other is not going to move anywhere forward. We've seen
Hmm.
countless clean cooking projects fail because there wasn't the right approach to the end user. There hasn't been the right
Yeah.
marketing or the right awareness raising strategy applied, and that's fundamental. So, same with policy. It can be the most spectacular policy framework, but if there is no financing and funding,
Yeah.
no one is moving forward with any project. And so now, with climate financing picking up again, with potential grant-based financing from several of your of your large banks and development banks looking at clean cooking, we do see a brighter future, but still putting together the amount of funding available at this point and considering the subsidies needed to make
Yeah.
these technologies affordable, we're still far away from reaching that level that is needed. So I would focus primarily on policy and financing, because we do have specialists already that are experiencing clean cooking that can definitely provide the other part when it comes to behavioral change communication. That is extremely important.
Yeah. So it sounds like Africa has a ton of potential for expanding both agriculturally and then turning that into a value add profit through bioethanol that can go into transportation, cooking, other resources as well. But that with the right elements in place, it really can be successful. And the financing, that investment piece, and then the policy piece, both of those are really going to help spur that success on the continent.
Agreed. And one final consideration, I think, which is extremely important when it comes to clean cooking, is innovation. We've seen
Yeah.
companies innovate. We've seen, for example, new metering technology that allows for stoves to be introduced on a pay-as-you-go basis. We've seen
Hmm.
technology that captures stove usage that directly feeds into uh, the climate finance platforms that companies are developing. It's we are moving in a very good direction, and the research and development seems to also be quite positive. And I do think that there is a new chance for the sector to take off when putting these elements together.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, thank you for sharing your insight on that as well. We are wrapping up, but I always have a personal question on cooking for my guests. And so I want to know if you prefer to cook or if you like to have someone cook for you. And if you're the one cooking, what's your go-to meal?
Well, in our household, mostly my partner is responsible for cooking. But when I do cook, I must say I have a guilty pleasure, and that is barbecuing.
Ah,
However,
nice. You fit right in the US, Boris.
however, I do choose a more sustainable alternative. So we do produce our own briquettes for some of the projects that we
Wow,
work with.
okay, okay.
From agricultural residues, from coconut residues, for example, in the context of Mozambique.
Yeah.
My barbecue it is more cleaner, but definitely need to reduce that element of soot emissions that it creates for the planet. So that's
Well,
my
you just
guilty pleasure.
taste, right?
Exactly. So I can't. One thing is sure, I cannot criticize anyone for using biomass for the taste element because I have that in my own culinary habits. But indeed, yeah.
Well, I think that's all right. I think you're justified in doing that with your clean briquettes.
Uh,
Wonderful. Well, Boris, it was so good to talk with you. You have a lot of experience in clean energy on the continent, and specifically clean cooking, bioethanol clean cooking. And so it was really valuable to hear your perspective and some of the elements on the continent that could really help develop the bioethanol industry there. So appreciate the time and so good to hear from you.
Thank you, Alicia. Thank you very much, and thank you to you and Pivot for always bringing us into the loop of new developments and working with us. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks. Thank you so much for listening. With over a third of the world's population lacking access to modern solutions and cooking with solid and polluting fuels like wood, charcoal, and kerosene, there are huge global impacts in multiple sectors. Pivot is passionate about opening access to household energy options around the world that also lead to reduced emissions, improved health outcomes, environmental protection, greater purchasing power, gender equity, and so much more. Join us for these personal conversations with farmers, fuel producers, distributors, stove manufacturers, policymakers, and consumers to learn about the dynamics that influence how people cook around the world. Please reach out to us at hello@pivotcleanenergy.org to find out how you can get involved. And we'd also be grateful if you found this information valuable and pass it along to friends, family, colleagues, your mailman, your grocer, anyone you know, and find some way to engage. Don't forget to follow us on our social media accounts like LinkedIn and Twitter. Check out our website at pivotcleanenergy.org. And of course, follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts so you can catch the next episode when it drops.